These missionaries, like Paul, were trying to convince people to stop worshiping their pagan gods, to worship the one God of Israel, and accept Jesus as his son who died for their sins. How could they convince people to believe in Jesus? They had to tell them stories about Jesus. Missionaries are telling stories about Jesus to convince others to believe in him. These missionaries are spread out throughout the Mediterranean, throughout the Roman world. When a missionary would convert somebody to believe in Jesus, that person then would convert their family members and their friends and their neighbors. When their neighbor converts, the neighbor would convert her family. Her husband then would convert a business associate, who would convert his wife, who would convert her neighbor, and so it went. Who's telling the stories about Jesus in this context of the widespread of Christianity? The vast majority of people telling the stories were not people there who were not people who were there to see these stories take place. They're people who've heard the story. Well, where did you hear the story? I heard it from my husband. Where did your husband hear it? He heard it from his neighbor. Where his neighbor? He heard it from his business associate. Where did he hear it from? He heard it from a guy who lived across the street. Where did he hear it from? He heard it from his wife. Where did he hear it from? She heard it from a visiting missionary. Where did the missionary hear it from? Heard it from some other missionary. Virtually everybody telling these stories is telling the stories even though they hadn't been there to see these things happen. And this is taking place for decades. That's the only way we can explain the spread of Christianity throughout the Roman Empire in the 35 to 65 years between Jesus' death and the first accounts of his life. Now, what happens to stories when they're in broad oral circulation? The example I usually use with my students is of a game many of them played when they were younger kids, sitting in a circle at a birthday party. One child tells a story to the next child, the game called telephone. And it goes around the circle. One child tells it to the next, tells it to the next, tells it to the next. By the time it goes all the way around the circle and comes back to the first child, it's a different story. If it weren't a different story, it'd be a pretty silly game to play because I just heard that story. The fact is, the story gets changed as it circles around the room. What happens if you play the game telephone, not just one afternoon at a birthday party among people from the same socioeconomic class who speak the same language at the same time? What happens if you play it for 35 to 65 years among people who live in different countries, who speak in different languages, who have different contexts and different concerns? What happens to the stories? The stories inevitably change. Sometimes the stories just change accidentally. Sometimes people change the story because they want to make a point. These people who are telling the stories are telling them for a point. They're not telling them in order to give objective history lessons about what happened in first century Palestine. They're trying to convert people to believe in Jesus. Sometimes they change the story.